afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this roundtable in the larger discipline of the health or the medical humanities, where we're going to be talking about art representation and uh, microbial lives. This roundtable is being organized as part of the Vulnerability Studies Network under the aegis of the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies, which is a teaching and research unit that functions out of the University of Hyderabad. The chairholder of the chair, Professor Pramod K. Nair, is a professor at the Department of Literature in University of Hyderabad, and he is here with us today. The speakers at the roundtable today are Dr. Somdatta Karak from the Center for Cellular and Molecular Biology, Hyderabad, Briony Barr, who is a conceptual artist and an honorary fellow at the University of Melbourne. And we have Sara, Kenney, who is a writer, director, producer, graphic novelist, a game producer even, and Dr. Meredith Li-Vollmer, who is from Seattle and County, the public health department there. And she will not be able to join us because of an exigency, but then we will be playing her talk towards the second half of the roundtable. Before we begin with the roundtable and we jump into today's topic, I'd like to invite Professor Pramod K. Nair to please start this roundtable off with a few words about the chair.
Thank you, Meenakshi. Welcome to Somdatta, Sara, Briony, and in absence, Meredith, who will be giving us a recorded talk. Thank you for joining us. The UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies was launched in 2022, and our unit is a teaching and research unit, as Meenakshi mentioned, and our mandate is to examine various kinds of vulnerability, from climate change to medical and health, economics to aging and poverty and gender. And we have covered quite a few of these in the events that we have organized in the last just about 2 years or so. The chair, as a teaching and research unit, also offers short-term programs and courses. We have done this course with the Queen's University of Belfast on aging in literature, co-taught with the Queen's University of Belfast. We have done short-term programs on SDGs and literary studies. We have had faculty development programs along more or less the same line. So the prospects for vulnerability studies, as we think of it as an emerging discipline, are quite vast. We also host a series of talks called Citing Vulnerability. This is the first roundtable devoted to the medical humanities, although we did have medical humanities component when Lisa Dietrich spoke in our first roundtable on conceptualizing vulnerability at the beginning of the chair's tenure. And the Vulnerability Studies Network, which was set up recently, enables those members of the network, Meenakshi is one of them, to run small programs. And these will be a little more specialized, keeping in mind what the chair's mandate is, but of course also the interests of the individual members of the network. I'm very grateful to Meenakshi and Sai University for enabling this particular roundtable, to the speakers, Briony, Meredith, Sara, and Somdatta, for agreeing, time zone issues notwithstanding, for agreeing to spend time with us. And I hope the conversations of the day are fascinating enough for many others. Part of the larger agenda is that when we shape this discipline, we hope people will also be interested in research domains and subdisciplines within this. Meenakshi herself has done her doctoral work in the medical or health humanities. We are, of course, constantly debating which side she is on, whether she's on the side of the medical or the health humanities. She's the second one, actually, to do her doctoral work on the area. Another scholar who did her PhD some time ago and is now teaching at Azim Premji University. And I see that other members of the network are here. Sapna Mishra, who's a public health specialist, Sharandu Bhattacharya from the Department of English. Thanks for joining in. And thanks to all the people who come regularly for our programs, Shubhada Nagarkar, Roy Matthew, of course, always the first to join. And specifically also to my friend and faculty fellow, Anna Kurian. I hope this is a fantastic conversation. And thank you again to all of you and to Meenakshi for conceptualizing this entirely her show. So we are delighted that this is also the first event of the year of the chair. And yes, so everyone have a good time.
Thank you, Professor Nair. All right, so without further ado, let's start off with today's event. Now, the event is called Art Representation and the Microbial World. And I come to this topic from the domain of the health humanities, but also from a fascination with comics and with the field of graphic medicine, which is the representation of health and disease in comics. And I was just speaking to you all about how I individually came across each of your works. So it is really the representation of disease via art and the graphic form that interests me. And it is via the graffiti that superheroes against superbugs, for example, created and took across to various universities, including the University of Hyderabad sometime early on in 2024. The Invisible War, in which Briony, you talk about World War One, and on two different scales specifically, and of course Surgeon X, in which Sara talks about a dystopian future in which antibiotics can no longer be used. That drew me to all of your work. The word microbe itself, I think, only entered the English language around the 1880s. And when it did, it immediately distinguished itself from the more prevalent word germ, which, in discourse, alluded to a very causative connotation of infectious diseases, wherein the word microbe alluded to a larger host of microbial agents, which might or might not be disease-causing agents. So we had microbes which were good microbes, which would help your gut, and then you had microbes that could lead to a pandemic. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to bring in all of these elements today, while talking also about how microbial lives exist not in isolation, but as in tandem with a larger field of elements, including scientists, including the community, including vulnerable sections of the society who do not have equal access to say, for example, antibiotics or other resources. So we're hoping to see an intersection between vulnerability studies, which is the mandate of the chair, and this specific interest of mine, which is the graphic form or art and microbes. So let's begin today's roundtable. Our first speaker. So how I've sectioned this is that we will be having two talks followed by a discussion, and then we will have the other two talks again. So the first two talks will be by Dr. Somdatta Karak and Sara Kenney, who are both talking about AMR projects largely. Our first speaker is Dr. Somdatta Karak, who is a science communicator who works with CSIR CCMB, which is the Center for Cellular and Molecular Biology in Hyderabad. She was trained in the life sciences, and she presently leads communication and outreach programs that seek to bridge scientific research in the community. She was trained as a molecular and cellular neuroscientist at the University of Göttingen, and she has been a Teach for India Fellow before. She is here today as a member of the Superheroes Against Superbugs initiative, which was launched in 2018 to work with the community to create awareness around antimicrobial resistance. Somdatta's talk today is titled Art for Complex Health Issues. Somdatta, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Meenakshi, and everybody at the chair of the Vulnerability Studies. This is an extremely interesting concept. Let me just share my presentation first. So like Meenakshi already introduced, I'm going to talk about our work at the Superheroes Against Superbugs. And Superheroes Against Superbugs is basically three of us, Sara, Ponnari, who co-founded this initiative, and I, along with them, we co-lead it with many volunteers who help us doing what we do. We work on something called as AMR, and AMR, for those who are not initiated to this term, means antimicrobial resistance. This is a situation where antimicrobial drugs are not working against the microbes that they're supposed to kill. Now, these are multiple different kinds of antimicrobial drugs. It could be antibiotics that are supposed to work against bacteria, antivirals which work against viruses, or antifungals against fungi, protozoals against protozoans. So, and this situation happens because these microbes evolve to escape the activity of these antimicrobial drugs. And such microbes are then called as superbugs, which is also featured in the name of the initiative that we run. So these superbugs essentially, I mean, maybe they're inevitable to come by, but they form much faster when these antimicrobial drugs are present in higher quantities around them. So the situation comes by because antimicrobial drugs are around us through unwarranted use, overuse of these, as well as overuse of these in multiple different formats. This could be personal usage that you and I do, or it could be the farmers who use it in their farms, or healthcare providers who make it accessible. And now all of these are very complex and interconnected to each other. And in our discussion today, we will try to also talk about that a little bit. And through these complexities, how do we make people understand the problem better? So we want to talk about AMR because about 6 million people die because of AMR across the globe. And this is data of 2021. And pretty much from this Project GRAM project, I mean, you'll find similar number of people dying every year in the last decade. And that's a huge number of people dying. And out of these 6 million people, about 1/6 of them, 1 million of them, died in India itself. India is really the hotbed of the problem of AMR, and we are the highest consumers of antibiotics. And remember, more usage of antibiotics also means more incidence of AMR coming by. We're the largest producer of antibiotics, which again also means that more amount of effluents going into the surroundings, into the companies. A lot of prescriptions in India are inappropriate. A lot of sale of antibiotics happen over the counter without even any prescription. So the problem happens at multiple levels. And yet, despite so many people dying, and which clearly makes it a public health crisis, public in India really is not aware of it. The three of us, Sara, Ponnari, and me, we are all trained as life scientists, and we work in a circle of academics and medical professionals, and where the topic is definitely discussed very, very avidly. However, when we talk to public of India, especially when this initiative was started in 2018, we saw that public did not even know of the phrase called as AMR, forget about understanding what AMR really means. And that is exactly what our basic objective is, that can we make people more aware of the problem of AMR? And we wanted to do that by partnering with young people. We wanted to give them the knowledge of AMR and make them our partners in disseminating the knowledge. Essentially, that's what we do. And we do this by also enabling scientists and medical professionals in our networks to engage with society at large. So we do this via workshops. Our flagship offering have been workshops. We also bring out stories of superheroes working against superbugs in India. We do these both such that science communicators, educators, and other scientists in India who want to talk about AMR have access to resources to also use it in their own initiatives and efforts. And we have also contributed a little bit in working towards state action policies of Telangana, Andhra, and Delhi. to state action policies against AMR. But we realized in our workshops that no matter how innovative our hands-on activities are or games that we introduce, learning about biology falls really short. And falls short because AMR is an unseen problem. And by unseen, there are two unseeness about this. One, microbes are not seen. Two, the problem or people dying of AMR is also really unseen in India. What I mean is that when people die here, even if the cause is AMR, most of the times the death certificate will say the death happened because of cardiac arrest, because that's the immediate cause of the death. And a lot of people would never know what was really behind this cardiac arrest or any other liver or any other organ damage that might be the immediate cause of the disease, death. So there's this unseeness, and because there is this unseeness about this problem, the problem also seems very distant. It is always about, oh, some 6 million people died, but those 6 million have nothing to do with me. The biology itself is complicated. And also, like I said, there are multiple factors leading to this problem. And as a result, it's always very easy to think that my own individual capacity and contribution will mean nothing for a problem which is as gigantic. And the last is in a place like India, where there are innumerable number of health problems, there is really not as much interest in discussing just another health problem. So we needed to work around these problems, and we found arts to help us bridge these barriers or go across these barriers. And by arts, I mean we use visual arts, we use performative arts, we use a lot of dialogue and storytelling in raising our awareness on AMR. Let me start with our work on grassroots comics. So these are basically simple comics made on 2 A4 size papers divided into 4 quadrants, and people just get black pens and sketch pens to talk about one problem per comic. And we did this in collaboration with an artist called Sharat Sharma, who is the founder of an initiative called as Grassroots Comics. Grassroots comics in India. I mean, he's basically the founder of this concept of grassroots comics. And the idea is that everybody can tell stories if the tools of telling stories are easy enough. I mean, so people should not be intimidated by the idea of telling stories. And telling stories through words can be intimidating in a place like India, where literacy is not the highest. And hence, grassroots comics relies a lot on using visuals that the storyteller themselves make. And as a result, the characters and the settings that are depicted in these comics look like their own life settings. The characters look like them, they speak. I mean, by speaking, I mean the dialogues that are written in these comics, they're written in a way, in a language that are spoken by the storyteller itself here. So these students that you're seeing here in this picture who are making these comics, they first undergo a workshop on understanding the biology of AMR. They understand the complexity of AMR, and then they are asked to pick one aspect of AMR that they connect with. It could be, I mean, they relate with different various things, and I will also show you some examples here. So these are some comics that young people of a place called Ropar, which is in north of India, in the state of Punjab, related with. Ropar is a tiny town with a river, with a huge river flowing by, and a lot of people in that city basically do agriculture. And their comics, for example, I mean, you'll see people wearing turbans in some of these comics. That's because people in that region wear turbans. You see comics in Hindi and English here. Some comics were also in Punjabi, which is the language spoken there. But at the same time, what I want to bring your attention to is they're talking about topics that are really close to their heart. They're talking about how antibiotics are polluting their river, which is really the lifeline of the city because they're agriculturists at the end of the day. They're talking also about antibiotic usage in poultry farming. And they're talking about also how the antibiotic producing company, and they really have one in their own vicinity, how they need to have better measures to contain the possible pollution from the company. On another hand, I also want to bring your attention to the differences that we saw in two different kinds of schools in Hyderabad. One school the two different schools that I'm talking about here, one is a usual urban elite school, the other is a government school. And the government school is a state government school, it's a residential school and gets students from marginalized communities. And we saw that the students of the state government school, they spoke a lot about issues of hygiene, whereas on the other hand, students of the urban elite school, they spoke a lot about how antibiotics are more easily accessible to them and hence they misuse them whenever they need be. I mean, by misuse, a lot of their stories were about even when they get a viral infection, they go about using antibiotics because they don't know that antibiotics will not cure a viral infection. So we saw these differences, and we saw that the comics also helped us in understanding how these communities relate with different aspects of AMR, and which becomes important for us when we want to design our communication for these communities in a context specific way. So once these comics are made, not only we put them up on our website and use it for other science communicators and educators, the storytellers and the comics makers themselves also have the ownership on them, and they use it to tell their friends what they have learned about and what they have understood of this problem. At the same time, we have also started partnering with another initiative in Hyderabad, which is called Do Science, and they have a vending machine of stories, and which is called Storybox. And we have started making stories for them. And as you see in the picture here, they need to click on a button and the story really comes out for students. Not only stories, we have started making other activities as well. And these are very popular in various schools in the city. Now, we also wanted to come about with strategies that will let us talk about AMR in public spaces, because all the other examples that you saw were for younger children in school setting. And we realized that we also needed to talk about this problem to slightly older people who have more agency about what they can do in their lives to fight against this problem. And we started making murals because murals could be either made or taken to public spaces. The first one that we made was in collaboration with St. Anne's College in Hyderabad. And this was done again in collaboration with an artist whose name is Dibhush Jena. And you see the mural on the screen as well. And we took this mural to various different locations of the city, including to the University of Hyderabad at some point. Similarly, we also made another mural. This was done in collaboration with school students, and school students were again we discussed with them about the problem of AMR. They made their own stories, and that was translated into a mural in New Delhi at Khan Market. And this was again supported by the Netherlands Embassy and done in collaboration with Delhi Street Art. And this is what the entire mural looks like. Now, despite making these murals, there's the problem here, because when public look at them, these are visible to public, but when public look at them, there's nobody really there to explain them many a times. And as a result, they can also lead to oversimplification or misinterpretation. By misinterpretation, like some of the common things that we have seen is, for example, people tend to think, oh, antibiotics are all bad, we need to just stop taking them. And that's not the case. Antibiotics are, of course, useful drugs, and they just need to be taken carefully. And now, what it means to take antibiotic drugs carefully is not a simple thing. And that's where we really think that conversations are helpful and are necessary as well. As well as it is very difficult to quantitatively evaluate the effect of these visuals. We see that they attract people, but Are they attracted simply because it's pretty, or it really makes them think a little more? We have not found a very good way to quantitatively evaluate that. And hence, what we have started doing is using these murals as a backdrops for having more conversations. So we have hosted street play in front of the mural of and that we have in Delhi, or in Hyderabad in the movable mural. What we conduct an event called as Magnetize Your Creativity, where we invite people to come and go through the mural, ask them to pick an aspect of the mural that they connect with, and build a message around AMR, which mostly serves as a daily reminder for them or their family members who they want to gift that magnet to. But we have seen that it is important to have these kinds of associated dialogues along with these visuals, so that people can have a little more detailed conversations around this, not just be attracted to the colors that we use in these visuals. So I just want to close my session saying that visuals help catch people's attention. And we hope that if they spend more time looking at something, it also hopefully leads them to thinking a little more around it, or at least the topic stays in their mind for them to think about it later on, ruminate on it later on. Art, just like science, can also be very complex and abstract, and hence it is important to pick a format that feels within the reach of people's skills and understanding. It should not intimidate them. And if you can pick a format like that, such as grassroots comics was a medium for us, then you can make people themselves make their own art. And when they do that, you can bring out their own stories. And such stories can make for relatable narratives for different communities, and those inspire people to take action. With that, I'll close. And if you want to know more, you can follow us on these various links. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Somdatta. I'm sure there are questions. I myself have questions about how you conceptualize the kind of art that you put out. But we will take these questions after Sara's talk as well. Our next speaker is Sara Kenney. Sara is a writer, producer, director. She's based out of London, England, and she's written Surgeon X with John Watkiss on art and Karen Berger as editor. She's also worked on Planet Diewalk 91, which is an allegorical story exploring the pandemic. She's worked with young people in South Africa, the UK, and India. And she's also produced a game called She Could Fly, which is based on a graphic novel of the same name by Christopher Cantwell, and which talks about the lived experience of OCD. Today, Sara's going to talk about Surgeon X and how comics can help us tackle the problem of antimicrobial resistance. Over to you, Sara.
Thank you so much. Right, I'm just going to attempt to share my screen. Are you all seeing that okay?
Yes.
Brilliant, brilliant. Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak here. As has already been said, I'm going to share my experiences of creating a comic exploring antibiotic resistance. The idea formed actually back in 2014, and the comic was published in 2016. And it was very much for an adult audience, so kind of quite different from what Somdatta was talking about, 16 plus, I would say. And we explored a whole variety of themes. And during this presentation, I'm going to talk through on how we tackle those. And think a bit, I guess, because it's been 8 years since we created this comic, think about how the pandemic might have impacted things, and think about, you know, how our knowledge has changed and the thinking around antibiotics and the communication of antibiotic resistance has emerged from this point. It's not a perfect project, but there's been a lot of learning, and we're sort of exploring now whether we can release the comic as a digital immersive experience for free on the internet. And the comic had sort of a whole variety of materials, animations, documentaries, a whole load of supporting materials that went with it. So I'll give you a glimpse of some of that. So hopefully that will play okay. So just a bit of a story here. Hold on, bear with me a second, see if I can get this to move on. There we go. So a bit about my background. So yes, I've worked in television, comics, games, etc. for 25 plus years. I always work with sort of science or health themed stories. And I don't really think of my work as education as such. I think about sort of creating spaces for scientists, artists, different types of publics to come together to think through a subject, to think through not just the science, but the ethics, the philosophy, the history, and then think about how that informs a story. So we take a really, really sort of interdisciplinary approach to that. And we work a lot sort of using that participatory arts approach and also thinking about how we create change. So we use sort of theory of change models that look at what is the impact we want to have from that project. And I'm currently working as the sort of innovation and engagement manager for the Environment Agency, where we're exploring some more of that community engagement work. So in terms of the art of Surgeon X, I worked with the late artist John Watkiss, another artist Warren Pleece, Karen Berger, who set up Vertigo Comics, which is a sort of a brilliant line, James Devlin on colour, Jared Fletcher on letters, and Richard Bruning on design, and a whole host of scientists, historians, philosophers. And what was really interesting about this is, as journalists, we really want sort of to be independent when we tell these stories. And I was funded by Wellcome Trust, Royal Society of Chemistry, and they didn't have editorial control. We were really able to sort of play in this world and run these workshops and think about what the future might hold without sort of having any sort of editorial control. And I think that's why comics are such an incredible medium. You're able, as a creator, to sort of tell stories in ways that aren't necessarily influenced by television channels or broadcasters that might hold certain political views. And so it was really, really important that we had that freedom, and that was quite powerful. So Surgeon X is set in the future. Well, it's not in the far future now. It's 2036. It's set in London, but has a sort of a global outlook. It features a family called Rosa, Martha, Lewis, and John Scott, who are in various sort of medical roles. There is a far-right government in power in the future. We've invoked this, and there is rationing of antibiotics. It allows us to explore a world that we don't want to come to pass. So I guess it's a what-if scenario where we don't want to see these things happen. Here are some sort of images of the family. The lead character, Rosa, is Anglo-Burmese, reflecting my heritage. And as I said, we've got sort of characters from all around the globe who are based in London. We have Mai, who's a surgical nurse. She's living with antibiotic-resistant gonorrhea. We have Priya, who sells antibiotics on the black market in East London. And through Priya, we get the perspective of a family in India as well. She's a really, really feisty character. I absolutely love her. And she gave us a really, really interesting look at sort of, you know, the hypocrisies that we see in the global north and how how it impacts the global south. And so we get to sort of explore that political angle as well. Okay, so now I'm going to play the trailer. Hopefully you'll be able to hear this, but it gives you a sense of the sort of multimedia aspect of it all. So what I think is important to say about these characters is they're not perfect, right? They all have light sides, they all have dark sides in which their behaviors, their ethics are dubious. And through having characters that kind of challenge the sort of the hero narrative, that somebody just sort of boldly solving the problem and going forward and making it perfect, it gives you a sense of how perspective, where you're situated globally, how you think philosophically, where you are politically, economically, how all of those are going to impact how the antibiotic story plays out. And, I think it's really important for us to think that we're not one amorphous mass audience. We're not one set of people that are thinking in the same way. There are many, 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 many different stories that need to be told. And those perspectives are varied, and people aren't all honorable in the story. So I think that's what we try and get across in the comic. We have a lot of historical stuff in the comic as well. So we have Rosa Scott, who's the surgeon who gives up her job. She sets up a black market surgery in order to treat patients how she thinks best. And she makes decisions on who will live or die. Her sister is a microbiologist looking for new antibiotics. She's traveling the world doing this work. And she also is a massive fan of history. So through her eyes, we see the historical evolution of how we've got to this point. Why is it now that we're struggling with antibiotics? So you really, really get a sense of that in this story. Also, I think it's important to say that we created this. It was supposed to be sort of quite satirical and sort of fun public health campaign, and it was run by this far right government that's in power, and it's thinking about how do you sort of portray these stories in public health circles. And we've gone for the sort of the blame culture one, like, thinking about who's going to save us. I'm just going to play this film. This was obviously before the pandemic, but just have a little look at this in terms of the tone of it.
Hand washing can prevent you getting sick from germs that are resistant to antibiotics. Scrub with soap for 30 seconds, rinse thoroughly, and dry on a clean towel. Amputations have risen 25% due to antibiotic resistance. Don't take risks. Wash your hands or risk losing your limbs.
So we have several of these little clips, and sort of the narrative is really about personal responsibility versus a community-minded ethos and sort of state responsibility. But, in a community-minded society, staying safe from bad microbes is not as simple as washing your hands. Like, do you have access to clean water, to soaps, to sanitary surroundings? Do you have to work, take public transport to work in public spaces? Do you have the luxury of isolating? And the pandemic brought a lot of this home in terms of looking at what we were able to do in terms of preventing the spread of disease. So although the narrative of personal responsibility is important, in the world of Surgeon X, it becomes extreme, and sort of there's a real blame culture that comes about in this. To the next one. So where did this come from? I think I basically brought into the story this idea of rationing and what would it look like if we had to ration antibiotics. And this didn't come from, I took this from the real world. So in 2013, the UK government proposed to NICE, which is the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. They help the UK government to decide on what medicines we can use, the economic benefit of using those medicines. And in this story, in this real story, the government proposed that we put a monetary value on people who were likely to take the drugs in terms of their contribution to society. So what that would mean is that older people with less years to work would score lower. Women who were mothers who didn't work would score lower, or men who didn't work would score lower. Disabled people would score lower. So the idea was that you would base a test for medicine on somebody's economic value to society. Now, that sounds absolutely bonkers, and we took this forward into the story. NICE rejected it and said, no, we're not basing it on this. But it's not hard to think that if this has already been proposed, in the future, you could have a world where rationing occurs. And thinking about rationing, obviously, in some places, rationing, it is a problem. There is overuse. But in other places, people don't have access to antibiotics. So it's not about rationing, it's about whether you actually fairly can get your hands on antibiotics to keep you alive. And so a lot of the stories that we feature in the comic actually come from real world scenarios, and they sound quite unbelievable, but we really work with the scientists and the historians and the experts to think about them. So at the beginning of issue 2, we see Rosa trying to get some antibiotics, trying to steal them from her dad's sort of private hospital, and they're under lock and key. And, you know, we know that now we face overuse in cattle, in growth of flowers, and while some people don't have access. So I think thinking about the messaging of overuse versus some region where they don't have access to them is really, really important. We had a really interesting clip from Nick Newton, who's a surgeon in the Royal Navy, who talks about this notion of rationing, and he helped us sort of think through it. But I'm just going to play this.
Rationing, I think, is very different from triage, where we're providing limited resources to the maximum number of people. It's actually turning around and saying, this is a treatment that might benefit you or probably would benefit you, but we're not giving it to you because you've had your share. And now, I certainly have a problem with that. I think most doctors would have a problem with that. Economics is not the only measure of a society. How just we are to the people that need our help is, by many measures, an important component. And so to limit rationing purely to economics is fairly one-dimensional, and in the long run, I think would lead to a very, very odd and slightly bankrupt society.
So this is why, you know, we need our ethicists, we need our sociologists, we need our historians, our anthropologists to step forward and be part of this sort of storytelling as well. Because we know from climate change, if it was just about the science, we would have fixed a lot of things. It's never just about the science. There's so many different competing economics and, you know, even sort of some players who are dubious in this. So we need to sort of really, really lean into
rationing, I think.
Different types of experts in order to kind of solve this. So this comes, you know, brings me to sort of storytelling. You know, I'm a massive fan of disaster movies, horrors, thrillers, but there has been research about the use of fear when we look at sort of antimicrobial resistance, and actually it can paralyze people and it can stop them from acting. I am really interested in having conversations with people about this, you know, because there has been some research that tells us that during the pandemic, people who'd watched disaster movies, who'd watched The Walking Dead, who'd watched those sort of things, were actually felt more secure because they'd rehearsed, you know, being in these sort of future situations, and it stressed them out less. So I think there are different situations in which emotions can be used in our storytelling. I also think to take one emotion in a story is incorrect, because when you're creating a story, you want people to go on a journey of emotions. You want them to feel happy, sad, love, fear, all those different things. And perhaps it's more that we shouldn't end feeling fearful. We should have hope, etc. But that fear can be part of that sort of that narrative, that emotional narrative that you like. And it can be powerful in getting us to listen. But maybe it's the thing that we need to go away with is hope. And how do we build those into our stories? But I'm going to play you a little clip about in the comic where the plague returns, and it's a sort of mutated version of plague, which definitely leans into the fear aspect of it. And it's narrated by the brilliant Professor Alice Roberts, who's a presenter here in the UK.
Leave quickly, go far away, and come back slowly. This was the advice from medical giants Hippocrates and Galen when it came to the plague. Doctors throughout the ages have feared the plague, also known as the Black Death. The most devastating pandemic occurred in the 1340s, killing 100 million people, a fifth of the world's population. The plague is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis and takes three main forms: pneumonic, septicemic, and bubonic. A super plague could travel fast, crossing London in a matter of hours, and humans could reach most places on the planet in 24 hours. So could the plague. The death rate could be terrifying, a game changer for civilization.
So I think, you know, we do need to think about very, very clearly sort of who the audience is, what is the message that we are sharing, and what is the medium as well. So I was again been leaning into a bit Marshall McLuhan, who's famous for saying the medium is the message. And each medium has a unique type of environment whose widespread use reshapes people and culture. So when we're watching the news, we expect facts, we expect sort of a sense of reality. When we watch drama, we are able to suspend our disbelief. We are able to sort of think this isn't real. Maybe this is a futuristic scenario we don't want to travel in. What can we do to avoid it? When we watch a horror, we understand, we enjoy the emotion of the horror. So films like Get Out or the Walking Dead series, they allow us to sort of have those feelings in safe spaces, but also they can bring up these amazing, amazing issues. We know that social media is even rewiring our brains. So I think it's not just about the stories, it's about the medium we're communicating on. Are we using social media? Are we using comics? Are we using film? How do each of those differences, different mediums, impact the way that our audience is thinking and feeling? And importantly, how might it make them act? How might it lead to action or not, as the case may be? So the medium, I think, as well, when we tell these stories, we really need to think through that. And there's a really, really lovely, very recent piece of research that came out, which was based on Don't Look Up, which looked at, it was about an asteroid impact, but it was an allegorical story really about climate change. And what this bit of research did is it was really, really interesting. It did a rigorous randomized controlled trial to assess the film's impact on climate change beliefs and attitudes. And it looked at it on its own, but also when it was paired with video from the marketing campaign and all extra materials. And it found that when you pair a piece of, drama or whatever with all these extra materials, it can have quite a really, really big impact. So I think when we create these pieces, what is the supporting material that we have around it that can actually sort of give more information, clarify, help us to kind of think around, the implications for the allegorical story. So I think it's a really great piece of research and could be really helpful for our work around antibiotic resistance and thinking about what we need to add to these stories. So also, coming as I get towards the conclusion, this isn't an insurmountable problem, antibiotic resistance. We know what needs to be done. A lot of it is about politics, economics, and government will to do this. In the story, we have Martha going off around the world looking for the new antibiotics, looking, she's in Burma, Myanmar here, looking for that sort of holy grail. But we also know that this isn't a problem that can be solved. We're going to be in this ongoing battle with bacteria that become resistant. It's not like, tick will solve it. It is going to be something that we'll have to create. We have to create some systems change around this so that as we move into the future, it's not something that just keeps coming back to bite us because of all the issues. We need to find ways and systems so that as we move forward, it doesn't become a big problem again. So I think looking at how we create that systems change to create that long-term change is going to be really, really important, because people often think, oh, we can just solve it and we'll be fine, and we can't. So I want to say thanks to the funders who just non-academic mortals like me can't make this sort of work without having funders to kind of help with this storytelling, and also just being able to do it in a way that in the medium of comics, there's hardly anybody that will fund comics. So having that sort of support is really, really vital. And in conclusion, thinking about the learning, always audience, who is our story for? There's not one audience. Is it for politicians? Is it for young people? Is it for children? Is it for parents? Is it for elderly? Thinking about that is really key. The medium will change how people consume the story. The medium is the message. And I think we need to think deeply about that. What do we want people to think, feel, do? So as our stories, how do we create that action? And I think there's a lot more research that needs to go on about how we create that action. And storyteller, who gets to tell the story, right? We don't just want stories from the same people. We want all sorts of different people around the world to tell their stories, because they will have, lots of different perspectives on this. And so the world feels scary and dangerous. So how do we design these stories in a way that sometimes, can make them appealing and hopeful and fun, and sort of using humor, I think, could be a big part of that. So here's just a final panel from the comic. Rosa having a chat to her digital stalker, Hippocrates, who basically remembered telling her to remember her oath. And I think, that's the important thing. The ethics and all of that side of it as well is really, really important for the stories that we tell. And there's my contact details. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak.
Thank you so much, Sara. And we'll just pause over here and take questions, observations, if you have something to, you know.
Meenakshi,
Yes,
uh,
who's that?
I'm Roy.
Yes, Roy, please go ahead.
I had an observation based on both the speakers' talks. Both spoke about very daunting prospects of antimicrobial resistance. But from my reading of Dr. Li-Vollemer's book, uh, it points out an instance where, thanks to affordable community clinics in the US, a person is able to go access healthcare, and she's diagnosed with breast cancer. But as she is a female to male transsexual, this actually brings good news, as in she sees this as good news. So, as Sara Kenney pointed out, the whole variety of human responses to situations are what make them more, interesting. So I was thinking, in the context of antimicrobial resistance, as shown in the film, that it has increased the amount of amputations, medical amputations. I was thinking of this specific interesting group of people who are called voluntary amputees, who feel they are not complete unless they have a limb amputated. They have a, they have a feeling of incompleteness. They have a feeling of disappointment when the limb is still part of their bodies. So, I was thinking, even prospects that seem very daunting to most of us, even those could offer. It's a bit ironic, and it's a bit, interesting that even such prospects could offer hope to at least a small category, a specific category of people. It's a rather macabre observation, but still.
Thanks, Roy. You're right. Dr. Meredith Li-Vollmer in her work, Graphic Public Health, she, brings together this anthology of comics cut across various different experiences that she's also had, looking at people from with different medical vulnerabilities. And you're right in that the degree of these vulnerabilities often decides what you're open to and what you're not open to. I'm sure Sara will have a lot to say about the role of amputation in her book. For example, the protagonist herself finds herself in an ethical conundrum of sorts when she's resorting to amputation as the only medical action that she can really perform. There's a lot of violence built in there. Violence, but not really a violation of sorts, because people want to be cured, and they're looking for any sort of option that they can take up to do that. So I'll let Sara also jump in on this.
I think that sounds like a really good sort of maybe horror stroke thriller, and one person's utopia is another person's dystopia, right? At the end of the day, depending on how you're looking at it. I think, with the amputation story, that was, based on the very simple idea that cuts can kill, and historically, I think it's something like 40% of deaths were from some sort of infection. And we are so privileged now, or a lot of us are privileged, in that we can't even imagine what that history must have looked like. But I think, there are certain situations, and it's not, we're not going to experience it in the same way globally, in the same, climate change we don't experience in the same way. If you've got infrastructure, and if you've got, certain levels of privilege, then your experience of it will be very different, even though it is a global thing. And I think these individual stories and these individual perspectives, this tapestry, is really important, so that we understand that we're not all looking at it in the same way. So maybe you should write that story, Roy.
I had an observation and a question to both Somdatta and Sara, and this is about the very different color palette that has gone into each of your work. So, Somdatta, all of the comics that SAS has created alongside World Comics India and Sharad Sharma, of course, is will decidedly more cheerful than the dystopian comics that Sara has introduced to us, comics that Sara has introduced to us. There's a certain martial metaphor I see that is predominantly used in both of your works. And this is something that, the metaphor of war, the metaphor of battle that pits the individual against the disease, and sometimes the individual against community, the individual against a larger cultural and historical discourse already set in place, which, we could see more in the novel Surgeon X. Uh, 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 this sort of battle metaphor is something that is already set in place in the discourse of medicine itself. It's always the body waging war against disease, but you've used it very differently, haven't you? I see monsters. I see that the microbes become monsters in Somdatta's comics, but I see that there isn't really a lot of representation of the microbes themselves, or in sort of personification, etc. In Surgeon X. Surgeon X is more about the ecosystem that brings these into place, and then sustains them, or helps in sustaining the people who've lost access to them, etc. So while Surgeon X is about the microbes on, it's still based on the human scale, whereas Somdatta's is based on a microbial and human scale. So in that large graffiti, that piece of the mural that you showed us, you have this large shield in the middle, and you have the microbes on one hand, you have the humans on the other, and you put them all, on the same scale over there, and you've drawn them very differently. It's very prominent that the microbes are monsters over there, but they're still very colorful. You still want to look at them, you still want to engage with them, which is a far short from the way the prospect of antibiotics gone out of existence is portrayed in Sara. So there's a definite you know that these are extremities in tone, the way that you guys have portrayed your stories. So tell us a bit about how you conceptualize the microbe or the ecosystem around microbes. What happens during the storyboarding concept? How do you decide to make these microbes so colorful? Or how do you decide that, this cultural historical war with all those indictments and those hands telling you to, asking you to declare your productivity or your PCI score? How do you decide which of these elements goes into your stories?
May I go first?
Yes, please.
Okay, thanks. So at Superheroes Against Superbugs, one of the core objectives is to give out hopeful messages. So I think that in many ways also determines the color scheme that you will see around everything at SAS. I mean, the grassroots comics, of course, are just black and white, so there is no color play there. But the murals, I think, definitely is inspired from this philosophy. Talking of microbes being constant, or humans and microbes constantly being at war with each other, the biologists in us are definitely not happy about that narrative, because we really do not look at it that way. However, given that in our way of coming up, basically in our style of storyboarding, where the other young people who are learning just about AMR are a huge partner in how they are looking at this problem, it is also reflective of how they look at microbes. And unfortunately, the narrative of microbes is largely as that of germs, as that of causing diseases and havoc. But thanks, thanks, Sara, for also chipping in the comments. Sara is also one of our, she's the co-founder of SAS. So you will see in the mural that we made in Hyderabad, if you look at it closely, we were actually very unhappy that the narrative is so microbes against humans. And if you look at it closely, we then also decided to add in some good, we call it good microbes. Again, that's a poor vocabulary, but microbes that we know that are helpful for humans, not only in general, but also in this crisis of AMR, such as viruses, which probably are going to be helpful in coming up with newer strategies, or other kinds of bacteria which will keep the disease-causing bacteria away. So we do want to bring in that angle in the conversation. However, we see that in the public discourse, microbes are generally looked at as villains. And after pandemic, every microbe is basically looked at as a coronavirus.
I think this is a really important point, and if you look back at the history and the philosophy of science and medicine, when is it that the war metaphors came in? And it was around the sort of Second World War, and a lot of other cultures have a much more holistic view to sort of staying well and not to become infected and then, battle against it. And I think it's really unhelpful because it actually shapes the medical environment. It shapes how we often get to the stage where we're really unwell before we decide to fight back. So I think we need some new metaphors. I think we need some new ways of thinking of living with disease, of actually sort of trying to stay well in many, many ways, rather than this sort of attack and defense sort of narrative all the time. And I think in Surgeon X, it was very much more about humans against humans rather than humans against microbes. It was a problem to be solved. It was more about discovery and a puzzle, and we have the thriller element to it. And actually the scientists in it, Martha and her mother, etc., they got a thrill out of trying to figure out, how do we locate new antibiotics? How do we scale it up? How do we work within the political system to do this? So I agree completely with Somdatta, what you're saying, how do we think about the metaphors that we use and the war metaphors, and how maybe do we start about inventing new ones? And I've always said I'd love to work on a big workshop with a whole bunch of public and experts to think about, well, what are the new metaphors we can create for these stories.
So in our workshops, for example, when we have the chance to do our flagship workshops, our first opening itself is that we all are part of an ecosystem where we coexist. And now, keeping that coexistence at the center of it, how do we deal with a problem like this? But unfortunately, not every forum and modality offers that kind of time and space to get into such details. And that's really one of the challenges that we also are trying to figure out how to work around that.
I had a question for you, Somdatta. When you're working with the children, with the students, before they create their own comics, you've sort of started to speak about it a little bit, but I wondered, how do you, what information, or how do you deliver the information in the first place to them, that then, because I presume they don't know a lot to start with.
So ideally, we like to work with students who have already studied a little bit about microbes. What I basically mean is that they understand that things called as microbes, there are things called as bacteria, virus, fungi. Basically the 5 different kinds of microbes. And that's the basic information that we look for in them. And then we use that as a starting point. And they basically know a lot theoretically about microbes cause diseases. And so they just need to be reminded of those. And then we take it ahead and think about what do we do when we get diseases? And that's where really our USP of the workshop begins, because when they say we take medicines, what kind of medicines do you take? We take antibiotics. Do you take antibiotics for everything? A lot of times, eventually the answer becomes a yes, and then we start saying that, but antibiotics don't work for everything. Not only that, if you take them too unwarrantedly, then there's a problem, not only at a personal level, but also at a public level. And then we explain them AMR. We have also developed a lot of hands-on activities for them to take them through understanding how antibiotics work only on bacteria, not on viruses, or what happens if you stop taking antibiotics mid-course. What happens if you have one resistant bacteria evolving, and how that takes over the population. We also explain them through hands-on activities, concepts of evolution, and how evolution is really at the center of this entire problem of antimicrobial resistance. So all of these things, in some way or the other, is there in their biology textbooks. Some of them in a little more detail, and some of them in passing, AMR, for example, is in passing. However, microbial classification or evolution generally features at some point or the other. But it is not necessary that the students that we are working with, we cannot take it for granted that one, they would have already studied it, two, even if they have theoretically studied it in their classrooms, if they have really comprehended it. So we do use a lot of hands-on activities to run them through these biology concepts.
Is there a difference in the way these stories are used when so you also run workshops for medical institutes, and I have seen workshops for nurses, for medical students, etc., that you've run around AMR, I suppose, and also um, uh, about tuberculosis, for example, and how AMR plays a part in all of this. So I'm wondering if you still stick to the hope narrative over there, or other affects like fear creep in there, because with risk communication, there's always going to be some sort of catastrophizing that's uh, got to come into the storytelling.
Right. So,
Yes. So how do
uh,
audience different?
yeah. Actually, it's not that. It's probably a little bit easier to work with the medical students. A lot of our recent work has been with medical students because they already know of the catastrophe part of it. So our focus there is to enable them to think of what tools can they use. And they're basically going to be the people facing this problem, right? I mean, patients and doctors are the frontline people at this crisis. So they know about it. So our attempt is to give them the tools of facing this problem more in a more empowered fashion.
Hi, Meena. I have an observation. Can I just?
Yes. Hi,
Yeah.
Sapna. Please go ahead.
Hi. So, yeah, this is again regarding the entire discussion we had on representation of the micro. And I come from a public health background, and the kind of discussion which we had when the COVID was at peak. And one of the challenges which public health community in general, like quote unquote experts, were contesting about was this whole representation of COVID being, as an enemy, because the response by the Indian state to counter this enemy was through, placing police all over the places, right? Or to putting commanders outside the home of the people who are extremely marginalized. So that was also the time. I don't work in the domain of graphic medicine, but the way also state utilizes certain narratives, like using virus or bacteria as an enemy, then also shapes a lot on what kind of measures you are going to bring in to contain the enemy. And I think that really devastated a lot of people, like millions of people in India, because we know that many people could not follow isolation, right? So this whole narrative of seeing virus or bacteria as your enemy, I felt, because we had this continuous debate and discussion in the entire group, should we really declare COVID as a war, or do we need to see it more as a public health problem? Because if you label this as a public health crisis, then the response would have been very different than you labeling it as a war or a battle. So yeah, this was just an observation I thought of.
No, absolutely true. And we also noticed our mural, which we took around the city, that it connected much better with the privileged people than the not so privileged ones. And probably it also stems from this narrative. I mean, how we look at wars also will be different for people having different lived experiences. So yeah, it's a completely valid observation and comment.
And just to add, I think it's really interesting. So I was working with Sara Iqbal, your colleague, Somdatta, during that on looking at young adult voices during the pandemic, and we worked with young people in India and South Africa and the UK, and we brought them together. and they shared the different stories of what was going on in their different countries. And it was really, really interesting, the extreme environments that some people were in with the, and in those situations, we know that fear can lead to control, and those war metaphors can lead to controlling people. So it is, like I said, I think that there's a whole gamut of emotions that occur when we think about these issues, and it's thinking about where do we slot them in, right, in storytelling. How do we want people to feel at the beginning, the middle, and the end? It's not one emotion, it's a whole range of emotions. And so that's why I think it's really important that language, that the tools of storytelling and how we leave people feeling, and that hope, you want people to have some sort of hope and you want people to take action. All of that is really important when we look at the sorts of stories and the sorts of messaging. I don't know, Sarah, if you want to add anything to that, because obviously we worked quite collaboratively over a year, and it was really fascinating to hear the young people's views and how their views fed into the stories.
Thanks, Sarah. And yeah, I think I would say that the young adults in India who worked on the Planet Evoke 91 project, they left the project with a hope. They entered the project really sort of affected by the pandemic and all the restrictions put on them, and their lives had sort of paused, and then they shared that they left the project with a lot of hope because of just the process of dialogue and discussion and reflections, and also problem solving, like collectively looking at how we can build a better future. I think that discussion and that sort of camaraderie was really helpful in making them more hopeful, and the process of making that building that story for Planet Evoke, which was a hopeful one, I think was quite a good one. Yeah. Thanks, Sara.
Can I also say, I just think regarding how we see microbes and how we represent them in stories, but also in campaigns such as in the pandemic when we were trying to educate people about microbes, we center ourselves as humans in everything, so we see the microbes as specifically attacking us, they're the enemy because we put ourselves as the center. And I think, Somdatta, you talked about it briefly, and so did you, Sarah, just how we can maybe represent microbes differently and think about them as one of many, many life forms that, we are part of, and just that idea of coexistence and levels of existence and interdependence, and everyone's just going about their survival. It's not specifically about humans. I just think that just because we center ourselves so much in our stories and in our lives, it's hard to not see something like a pandemic or bacteria doing their thing, viruses, whatever, as a threat. But that's just not, that's us putting that on the microbes. That's not the reality, is it?
That's a great point. I was also thinking along those same lines, and how in representations, especially graphic representations, it's become so important for us to or for the artists to draw a distinction between the humans and the microbes, which is why the microbes end up becoming these dehumanized, exotic others. However, there is a difference between dehumanizing them and demonizing them. And, once you cross over to the line of demonizing them, that's when the battle metaphor can't really, it doesn't budge. It's always the individual versus the other, which is the microbe over here. But I also had a last question for Sara, which I think might draw from this discussion about the community and the microbes being a part of our environment and ecosystem, which is that you also been a part of this production on the lived experience of OCD, and that's a very different story from your work in Surgeon X. And of course, one major difference is that it's based out of the lived experience of the comic creator, and this one is completely fictionalized. But another major difference is that the story with the microbes as all of these stories with the microbes, Somdatta stories, Briony's stories, they're all very community driven. I feel like once you have microbes in the picture, the story becomes more than just an individual's. But in She Can Fly, it's definitely a more individual narrative over there. So can you tell us a bit about, but then both of them are about illnesses, both of them do have the society and the vulnerabilities the society exposes you to in play as well. So can you tell us a bit about the differences in conceptualizing the illness experience in the game and the comic versus Surgeon X?
Yeah, so the game just came out and that explores, like you said, OCD and mental health. And I think really it's just a reflection of a shift in my practice. So back in Surgeon X and back in that time, a lot of the sort of the work that we did involved experts, right? So those experts were always the scientists, the historians, et cetera, et cetera. But, what's evolved and emerged is that lived experience is a just as valuable expertise. And actually, we've just put a bid in for some money that how I would work for the next iteration of Surgeon X online is that I would very much want to work with people who've lived experience of, resistant infections and patients, etc. So I think that it wasn't just in terms of the different way we worked. I think that was probably a mistake for Surgeon X in that time of not working with the lived experience as well. And now all our projects very much sort of consider that to be a really, really important element. So the game, from the very beginning, we worked with people who experience OCD, and we had a producer on the project who has lived experience of OCD. The person who wrote the comic has OCD, and the theory of change was developed with the lived experience and with all the experts. And I think that's that's definitely how we need to move forward when we look at the antibiotic crisis. We need to be working with people who've experienced it all around the globe, family members, doctors, everybody who's been affected by it, but patients and people need to be part of helping us to think through those solutions. So the differences were, not, I think it just shows how public engagement has evolved, basically.
Thanks, Sara. We will now be moving on to the third talk. Our third speaker is Briony Barr. Briony is a conceptual artist who is joining us from Brisbane, Australia today. She has since 2011 been working with the Scale Free Collective, and she has staged collaborative drawing experiments at galleries, schools, universities, science institutions, art museums, civic art studios, and conferences. And these have involved the participation of primary and secondary students, the general public, artists, physicists, and astronomers. The Scale Free Collective, which she is a founder of, is an art science collective which focuses on visualizing invisible microbial worlds. Briony has also collaborated on 7 storybooks and graphic novels, which have been translated into Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and Arabic. She is an honorary fellow at the University of Melbourne School of Physics. So we would love to hear a bit about that as well, perhaps after your presentation. Briony's talk is titled Microbes, Molecules, and Mucus, Expanding Ecological Imagination Through Storytelling. Over to you, Briony.
All right. So thank you for having me. Yes, my talk is called Microbes, Molecules, and Mucus, Expanding Ecological Imagination Through Storytelling. And this artwork that you're seeing here is from a storybook that I worked on. The artist is Aviva Reed, and that's a watercolor. It's a very small detail of a watercolor artwork, but I will show you more about that. So a little bit of background. My name's Briony, and I work with a microbial ecologist and we co-founded Scale Free Network. So that's the art science collaborative that was mentioned. And we started off in about 2007, 2008, doing workshops with children and sometimes the general public, combining microscopes and drawing. So getting people to think about what they could see through microscopes. People weren't looking at microbes, they were just looking at their, the fluff in their pocket, coins, insects, rocks, sometimes we looked at water samples, different things like that, just to think about how looking through the microscope takes you beyond your, regular human vision, and helps you to realize that there's details that you simply aren't seeing. And then the drawing process allows you to really go into that and think more about what you're seeing, and maybe ask questions and really slow down your observation. So we did many, many years of running workshops in different contexts, and sort of bringing those ideas together, and bringing the art and science together for people in an educational setting. But at a certain point, we wanted to go deeper, I guess, into communicating about science and the microscopic world and things that were beyond the human scale. So we started making books, and there were two ideas that really drove the idea to make books. And that was this idea that so much of life on Earth is invisible to humans. Only 1% actually of biodiversity of life is really visible to us. All the plants and animals and everything you've ever known is just such a tiny percentage of what's actually out there. And so there's all these incredible stories that, should be told. And also, there's so much, we've been talking about the war against microbes, and there's so much negativity around microbes, and, they're absolutely positioned as the enemy. But really, there's such a small percentage of them that are pathogenic and that will harm humans. And there are so many that are just simply part of life and part of our ecosystem, and we wouldn't be here without them. So this was sort of some of the motivation for creating some stories about that. So Gregory and myself joined forces with a writer and a visual ecologist, and worked with other scientists as well to create these 4 storybooks. And what they have in common is that they all explore symbiotic partnerships, life-affirming, positive symbiotic partnerships between microorganisms of some kind, and a larger form of life. So whether that's bacteria, or even fungi, that it's about that positive partnership and that interdependence. That's what is described in the book. So I'll briefly take you through just really quickly each of those books. So this one is about the partnership between mycorrhizal fungi and plants. And this is the first couple of pages. These stories are told from the perspective of the microorganism or the microbe. So in this first spread, you can, if you were to read it, you would see that it's told by the experience of the fungi spreading through the earth and looking for a plant partner. And this is a meeting of the plant and the tree root. And then some of the molecules and the sort of molecular, the chemical conversation that's involved. In the back of all of our books, we take sentences from the story, and we expand on on scientific detail and give more information. So you don't need to read this section of the book, but it's probably about a third of the book. But if you want to, we try to make it easy to go from an idea that you've read in the story, in the narrative, and then learn more if you would like to. We also try to position the microbes and any of the characters in a sort of ecosystem of being and of scale, of size. So we have everything from, you know, a sugar molecule, a glucose molecule, and some of the different bacteria or sand grains, through to the rainforest where it's set and the sun. So we sort of set up those relative relationships in that ecosystem. This one is set in the soil again, and it's about a entomopathogenic insect called a nematode, and it's about the symbiotic partnership that they have with bacteria that live inside them. And it's a bit more of a dark story, and they end up traveling through the soil and invade a grub and live in. They kill the grub from within, and the bacteria is released from inside the nematodes, and then they sort of reproduce many generations inside the grub. And then exit and start the life cycle again. So it's a bit more of a sort of darker symbiosis, but it's really about that incredible relationship between the nematode and the bacteria that live inside it and allow it to live its life cycle. And again, anything in the story, elements of the story are explored in more detail in the science section at the back. Zobi and the Zooks is set in the ocean, and it's about how coral bleaches, what happens when coral bleaches. It's sort of a breaking up story, and it explains why coral goes white, because it loses its symbiotic partner in a bleaching event. So that story is about that. And it's, again, told from the perspective of the bacteria living inside the sort of single coral polyp on the Great Barrier Reef. And again, the story is explored, elements of the story are expanded on in the back of the book. Another one set in the ocean. And this one is about the bacteria that allow this tiny little bobtail squid to glow. It has a bioluminescent glow. So the bacteria inside it have this bioluminescent quality. So it explores how that happens, and then how that allows the squid to hunt. And the story is written in two parts. One is from the perspective of the squid, and then one is from the perspective of the bioluminescent bacteria. And again, exploring the science further in the back of the book. So I've also worked on two graphic novels, so much longer form graphic novels, and this one's been mentioned. And for this one, the symbiotic partnership is actually between a virus that infects bacteria, a bacteriophage, and a human. So it's about how the immune system and this bacteriophage actually have a kind of partnership in sort of defending the body against Shigella bacteria, dysentery, which causes dysentery, and it's set in 1916. So the team is similar to the previous books, but we worked with a comic illustrator, Ben Hutchings, and then we always work with different scientists, but Dr. Jeremy Barr, no relation to me, was the consulting scientist on this one. And here's a few scenes from this one. So this does, it's called Invisible War, Tale on Two Scales. So the story is told from the human perspective, but it's very much told from the perspective of the virus, the bacteriophage as well, and also a lot from the perspective of the Shigella bacteria, who are the kind of the bad guys, even though I like to tell positive stories about microbes. You know, we all know that there are some pretty nasty ones out there, and dysentery is not fun. And this story was set in 1916 at a time when microbiology, when microbiology wasn't really practiced. So that was an interesting thing to think about, and also interesting, I guess, in thinking about perhaps how we might go back to a time like that. Because I mean, at this time in history, yeah, if you got a cut, you might die because there were no antibiotics at that time. And again, the back of the book connects to the story with a series of questions. So we tried to make it very user-friendly because there's a lot of science in the graphic novel. And you don't have to read the back of the book, but if you want to, you can find little numbers. So if you look down at the bottom right here, you'll see there's a little number, and here as well, and then that corresponds to questions in the back. And again, we put all the sort of characters and the setting, the river, the geographic, you know, the nations, branches of mucus, blood cells, everything in a sort of ecosystem of scale, putting everything in relationship to one another equally, whether it be a molecule or you know, or France. And the most recent graphic novel I've worked on is called Follow Your Gut, and it's really going much further into what is going on in your gut with all the microbes that live in there, and how does your immune system tolerate the fact that you've got other beings living inside you. And as the sort of tagline there says, it's about meeting that ecosystem that lives inside of you that you are interdependent with, and it really explores how a healthy human is really a collective effort with a lot of other beings that live inside of you. And similar team to the Invisible War, but working with Dr. Lisa Stinson, who's a reproductive microbiologist. And here's just a few scenes. So it's again narrated largely from the perspective of the microbes themselves. The humans are really just a setting. You know, they're almost the planet or something that the microbes live on. Occasionally we do see some of the humans, but it's really just about representing the bacterial point of view or the microbial point of view. And again, a large amount of this book is expanding on the science in the appendix. So with that similar question and answer connected to numbers that appear through the story. And one other book that I've worked on with Indigenous people in Australia is pronounced Damara, a story of termites on Gurindji country. And I mentioned this one because there is microbiology in this story, even though we're looking at termites from a lot of different perspectives. From a bush medicine perspective, but also so indigenous ecological knowledge, but also Western science. This book did incorporate a sort of view of the termites and actually what's happening when they eat the spinifex that grow in the landscape. Here we worked with the artists to represent that science, and sort of tell that story of what happens when a termite swallows the spinifex. And then this is using the dot style to represent how the spinifex is broken down by microbes in the termite gut. So that was a little bit of a different project, but it was an important part of it to represent the microbial perspective alongside all the other perspectives that are brought together in the book. So to bring it all together, I'll just speak about some common themes across all these works that I've sort of briefly touched on. So they all communicate complex science. They all use illustrated story. They're all told largely from my microbial perspective. They all have the interlinked reference material that I spoke of, and they're absolutely for the nerds, the science nerds, but they're also aiming to be approachable for people who are scared of science or who say they don't get science. They attempt to visualize invisible microscopic worlds. And I say invisible because they're invisible to us, but of course, they're very much there. And in doing this, we're really trying to center that more than human perspective and decenter the human as the perceiving subject, and just really take the human out of it where possible, or just treat them as one part of a bigger set of interdependent elements. And, you know, often, in Folio Gut, I often just, you think of the human as the landscape or just the ecosystem or the environment in which the microbes are living their lives. The books aim to expand what I'd call ecological imagination. So just that ability to imagine the world around us and to expand it beyond the human scale. I think that's a pretty big theme for me. And beyond that really typical nature that we all think of, you know, trees and dogs and cats and you know, penguins or whatever, you know, those really obvious things that, you know, we all care about, but that's just such a small percentage of what's actually out there and that we are interdependent with. You know, going back to the workshops that Scale Free Network started off doing, you know, we would take students, you know, from centimeters to micrometers to nanometers to femtometers, and just ask them, what do you think, and show them what's on this scale, you know, what's happening at this scale, what entities, what structures, what beings, what's going on these different scales, and then think about who's studying them. And so I think it's really about getting people to wonder at what's out there beyond their own limited sort of point of view. The books aim to inspire wonder and curiosity, which is pretty much just what I said, engagement and hopefully a kind of empathy for our microscopic kin, and helping to build that understanding that we all live interdependently on this planet. And I guess there's an aim that if we can expand our ecological imaginations to include these other kinds of worlds and beings, then, you know, surely that's a way to have a better chance of caring and advocating for their health and existence, and of, you know, shifting the balance away from you know, humans just determining and seeing themselves as always the central factor or the central subject. The books move readers across multiple simultaneous action on multiple scales of distance. So we're taking people, you know, from the human scale to the city scale to, you know, inside you know, under your fingernail, you know, to a crypt in your gut, you know. There's moving between these different physical scales and just showing the connections between them, and that relationality between all beings and phenomena. And oh, I've repeated that. They aim to highlight cooperation as a fundamental paradigm of nature through exploring those symbiotic partnerships. You know, we all know about survival of the fittest and competition and you know, that's such a driver of evolution. But, you know, that's just part of the story. Symbiosis and the spectrum of symbiosis and the interrelationship and cooperation between things is just as much a driver of evolution. They aim to challenge notions of essential identity and the concept of the individual. So just really problematizing that idea, like, is there really such thing as an individual? You know, those boundaries are so fuzzy, especially when you start to think about all the different symbiotic and independent elements that are going on within us, and that we're part of in a much bigger, you know, social system. You can expand that outwards. And I don't know, I'm always fascinated that, you know, our microbial cell, the microbial cells that live inside us really outnumber our human cells. So, you know, are we really human? And almost finally, the books are all made through a really highly collaborative and interdisciplinary process that, Sarah, it sounds like you very much go through on a regular basis as well. You know, you've just got all these different perspectives coming together, and it really requires that intense collaboration and bringing together of points of view to try to communicate about something as complex as some of these things. And we often, through every book that I've worked on, we've integrated feedback from students at key stages. So we take the book to schools and work with different age groups and different types of schools and get feedback to make sure people are understanding what we're trying to say, and see what kind of questions come from them. And my final point is just about that creative process. With the Small Friends books, which are the first 4 square books that I showed you, we developed quite an intensive group storyboarding process where we would all envision, once the story had been shaped to a large extent, we would all have a go at visualizing how we thought the story could be told. And then we would synthesize elements of that into a sort of master storyboard, and then once we agreed on that, then that's what we would then you know, give to, well, in this case, Aviva, the illustrator. And something similar happened with Folly Your Gut as well, where it was actually, the story was storyboarded twice before it got to Ben, who was the main illustrator. on that one. So thank you very much for listening to my talk. Here's some contact information, and yeah, I really appreciate the chance to talk about my work. Thank you very much.
What a fascinating talk. Thank you so much, Briony. I really appreciate the point about us existing as plural selves and, having to care about our microbial kin. So we will hold on to questions, and we will move on to our next talk and then come back for a round of discussion. Our next speaker is Dr. Meredith Li-Vollmer. Dr. Li-Vollmer isn't here because of a health exigency. However, she has sent us a recording of her segment to be played out. Dr. Meredith Li-Vollmer is a communications specialist at Public Health Seattle and King County, where she focuses on risk communication strategies to address public health challenges. She is also a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Population Health and Health Systems at the University of Washington. She has a PhD in communications from the University of Washington and has authored the anthology Graphic Public Health, a comics anthology and roadmap, which highlights the innovative use of comics in public health communication. Dr. Li-Vollmer's insights have been featured in various publications, including Graphic Medicine, and she has participated in several interviews communicating with vulnerable and non-English speaking populations. Dr. Li-Vollmer will be speaking about graphic public health and risk communication about microbes in the segment that she's recorded and sent over to us. I will be sharing the video in just 1 second.
And I'm a communications specialist for Public Health Seattle and King County, which is the health department in Seattle, Washington in the United States. And I'm here to talk about graphic public health, why comics work for risk communication about microbes. And I work on a team that communicates with the public about issues that affect their health. And that involves communicating a lot about viruses, bacteria, and other microbes. And we seem to be doing more and more of that regularly, as you can imagine. We were doing a lot of risk communication during COVID-19. So this first panel that you see is from a comic that I drew about that opening period of COVID-19 for us that started in January of 2020. We were the first health department and the first place in the United States to have a case of COVID-19, and that became the first place where there was an outbreak and the first COVID-19 deaths in the United States by February of 2020. I specialize in risk communications, and that means that I am really trying to help people understand risks, make informed decisions, and cope. And I started to use comics in 2008 when I was tasked with promoting preparedness for a possible pandemic. At that time, we were most worried about avian flu. And I found that people weren't very interested in preparedness for a pandemic until they heard stories about what happened during the Great Pandemic of 1918. And in 2008, a lot of people weren't even aware that there had been this huge flu pandemic and were surprised to learn how devastating it was. So we wrote a comic book telling what happened to a family in 1918 during that pandemic. And I worked with an artist named David Lasky on it. And in this comic book, we also were able to include a section where it talked to the descendants of the people who survived the 1918 pandemic and sort of illustrated what a pandemic in the modern day might look like. So now these illustrations might look pretty familiar to you about what a pandemic looks like. In 2008, when I tried to talk to people about what a pandemic might look like, it was hard for them to get their heads around it. And using comics, we were able to illustrate it and make it concrete. And so, now these look pretty commonplace. But back then, the comics was really a useful medium to really illustrate something that people had no memory of at that point. And my first experience with No Ordinary Flu, the comic book, showed me that really comics could be really useful in helping facilitate comprehension of very complicated or abstract health information. And so at that point, I started to use comics more for risk communication about communicable diseases from viruses and bacteria. And so here's a panel from information that we created about norovirus that really shows how just the illustrations alone in comics really have so much explanatory power, because in looking at this panel, you can really see what the main symptoms of norovirus are quite quickly and simply. But comics are much more than just images. It's really the combination of image and the text and the sequence that make comics unique. And so, you know, here you can see just from the images alone, a lot of information about how a flu virus spreads. And really the sequence at play here is important because you can see, you know, the person sneezing and then germs getting on a hand and how the hand might touch the doorknob. So there's a lot of information there. But then when you add just a little bit of text to it, it adds even higher clarity, right? You have sound effect, you have explanation of how flu germs spread when people cough, sneeze, or talk. If flu germs get on hands, they can pass the germs to other objects. So here, the combined elements in this comic really convey so much meaning in a very economical way. And the explanatory power of image, text, and sequence make comics really effective in explaining complicated or abstract concepts, and that in turn can help people make better choices about risks. So this is a comic that I made last year, How Contagious is Measles? When we had a cluster of measles cases in our county, and we have pockets of under-vaccinated people, and really particularly we've had a lot less vaccination since COVID in terms of, you know, people who were not able to keep up with the childhood vaccinations for their children during that time. And also because there's been a lot of misinformation out there, particularly about the MMR vaccine that prevents measles. And so we were really looking for a tool that could explain just how contagious measles are and what makes it different, especially because people really were thinking so much about COVID-19 still, and we wanted to show what the differences were with how this virus spreads, and also you know, what makes this measles vaccine so particularly effective. So here you see somebody who's been traveling, you see these sort of red dots that signify the measles virus that just hangs in the air. And then the sequence is so important because then you see that this person leaves the waiting room that they've been in, but you see the red dots of the measles virus still hanging in the air and showing that even up to 2 hours after that person has left, they still have the measles virus. You see that different people have moved into the waiting room and they are now exposed. And then what I really like about being able to tell this through comics is that you can see some different outcomes, right? So we talk about what happens if none of these people got the MMR vaccine and none ever had the measles. Up to 9 out of 10 would get the measles. But then if you see that that all these people were vaccinated, then most likely no one would get the measles. So it's showing how the virus hangs, and then also the different outcomes. And I think that this has been really important because it really expresses something about choice, right? Because we know now that choice is really essential in our communications about vaccination, that we really have to give a lot of credit to people for making those decisions themselves. We need to provide them with the right information. And when we give them that element of choice, we are a more credible source of health information. So I really like how comics allowed us to show consequences of choice. Good risk communication also depends on our ability to reach everyone in the community with critical health information. So that means that we need to make information as accessible and comprehensible as possible in the ways that I've already talked about. Comics help keep the amount of text low, which helps for people at different literacy levels. And then there's so much information conveyed through image and illustration. But I think good risk communication is also shared from person to person. And we use social media a lot to convey information, especially when we need to do it quickly. But we are competing with so much other information on social media, and everything is already so visual and graphic. And I think that people really are drawn to the hand-drawn, and I think that that can really benefit us in our communications. And I just want to show you a quick example from communications we did from related to the dangers of wildfire smoke. And we were trying to help people understand that in a wildfire smoke event, that they need to keep indoor air clean when it's really smoky outside, and we were trying to explain why that happens. So here's a cross comparison between what you see on the left is a comic strip that I did to try and explain that. And then on the right, you see that we had the same information, and it was presented in a series of attractive graphic slides. And you can really see the differences in the amount of interaction that we got on Instagram. When we had this hand-drawn comic, not only did we have, so many more likes, more than 1,200 more likes on it, but it was in the sharing that I think it's most interesting. So you see we had 443 shares as opposed to 6 shares. And we had people who were saving the information much more. Then when you look at the overall impressions, we had about 14,000 impressions when it was done as a comic strip compared to about 1,200 when it was done as just simply graphics. And so, I also want to share this comic strip here is a web comic that is one of our most viral pieces of content, no pun intended. And we made this comic, Pandemic in Seattle, as a web comic 10 years after we did the first No Ordinary Flu comic strip. And we did it to celebrate or to recognize the centennial of the Great Pandemic of 1918. So we did this in 2018, and then 2 years later, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic erupted. And all of a sudden, this webcomic started to get so much traffic. And so then I wrote a blog post that really discussed, what was similar in the pandemic that was unfolding in 2020 to what happened in Seattle in 1918. And this comic strip has become our second highest read blog with over 140,000 views, which for us is very high for people who actually open up and read a blog piece. And so, it made me think about, why does this continue to get, views even today? It was published in 2020. Was there something about this comic form that helped people process what they were going through in 2020? Is it something, there's probably something that's going on in the algorithm online, but also could there be something about how it still speaks to people about what they went through in 2020 as they look at what happened in 1918? And so this brings me to what I think is the most compelling reason to use comics in communication about microbes, and that is that there are narrative properties of comics that can really help address the emotions that are involved in stressful circumstances that involve viruses and bacteria and other microbes, and that can help people cope with and process their experiences. We know in risk communication that people have a hard time processing information when they're feeling high levels of stress, but that if we can help if we can actually address the emotion that they're feeling, it helps people cope, and it also helps them be able to better receive critical health information. In other words, people need to know that you understand what they are going through before they are ready to take any health advice that you have to give. And so here, this is an example from a comic strip I wrote in the fall of 2020. And so fall of 2020 was COVID-19. We've been, in various stages of lockdown. We did not yet have a vaccine for COVID-19. And in the health department, we were really worried as we were entering a big holiday season, what this was going to mean in terms of the spread of the virus, particularly to people who were much more susceptible to health impacts. And we knew that we needed to give advice about how to connect with your family in safe ways. We knew people would have a lot of longing and that they were very fatigued already from having to follow COVID measures. So how is it that we could introduce this guidance in a way that would be best received? And so I decided to write a comic strip that really illustrated my own dilemmas with COVID-19. And so here you see, that's me talking about how much I love holiday gatherings, but that this year's a real dilemma. I don't want to contribute to skyrocketing cases. And I talk about my own family members, my parents who stayed home as much as possible, my brother who's a diabetic who's been isolating. But that feeling, that seeing them feels urgent. And I talk about missing my parents who live in this different state, and that my dad has dementia and he's been changing month by month. I'm not there to help. But my parents are in high-risk groups for COVID. I worry that I could expose them if I travel. So here you see, I've illustrated different ways in which exposures could happen to COVID-19 through travel. So the comic strip goes on to talk about different ways that I eventually chose to celebrate the holidays, either by having Zoom calls with faraway family or to have outdoor gatherings with masks on with family that live locally. And really it was my hope that in showing my own personal dilemmas that we could really show empathy for people's lives as they were navigating the difficulties of COVID-19 at the time and the tough choices that it was requiring of all of us. And I also hoped that it would make the communications feel more authentic by showing this kind of empathy, and that we would be seen as more credible sources of information because we were showing that we understood what was at stake for people here. So, I think it's these human stories that really give comics a lot of power. I'm very interested in telling real life stories about people through comics. And I feel that comics can really carry a lot of emotional weight and reflect people's lives and experiences. So this is an example of how I'm continuing to use comics to talk about COVID-19. And in this case, I've been working on a series of comics about people who have been experiencing long COVID. And so here, this is an excerpt from a comic called Deepa's Story, and it's from this series about long COVID. So in this series, you meet Deepa, who is somebody who initially had a pretty mild case of COVID, but later started to have some symptoms of long COVID, of fatigue and headaches and nausea that required her to take time off work. But, then they got better, and so you see here they're moving to a new apartment. But after that, there was a big crash that we depicted. This meant that Deepa really had to change their life. And so after waiting months to get an appointment at the long COVID clinic, Deepa finds that they have to change their life, that they can only work part-time, and that, that they actually have to lie in bed to get work done and can only work in the mornings. So this was just part of the story we told. And, in telling the story, I was hoping that it could help people who have similar symptoms recognize that this is long COVID, because some people don't know that that's what it is. And we wanted to be able to provide some resources and tips for people on how to manage it as best they can. We wanted to show that COVID-19 has debilitating consequences beyond just what we have heard about hospitalization and death. Now things are safer with vaccines, but there's still the potential for long COVID, and there's still reasons why people should consider wearing masks, improving their ventilation, and also staying up to date with vaccine. But I think most importantly, I wanted to convey with these long COVID stories what long COVID patients are experiencing, because in talking with Deepa and with other patients of long COVID, they told me about how people sometimes don't believe them, that they have long COVID. They don't believe it's related to COVID. And it's particularly tough in their social worlds and with their employers when they are not believed. And people with long COVID, they need to have accommodations for their work. And they need understanding so that they don't feel so isolated. It's hard enough when you might have to suddenly quit your job or change how you work or not participate in family life or social life as much as you used to. And it's even harder when there's so little understanding. So, really the intent here is also to promote empathy. And I'm hoping that, using comics, we're able to express our own empathy for people's situations, but also encourage others to have empathy for each other and to process health experiences from new perspectives. And I was encouraged by a study that I read by Sara McNichol, who had done some in-depth interviews with people who had read some educational comics about a health condition that either they or a loved one had been experiencing. And McNichol found that the comics helped them relate to, respond, and remember health information better than if it was offered in a more abstract way. But interestingly, the interviews revealed that people found that the visual metaphors in comics provided avenues for them to understand their own health conditions from other perspectives and prompted them to reflect on and re-examine their own understandings. And so that's where I'm hoping to go with comics. And I think that they do have so much utility in explaining the risk of microbes on health. And also I'm very interested in using these storytelling possibilities to help people have new perspectives and insights on how we interact with viruses and bacteria and other microbes, and the choices that we make. And I'm hoping that by telling relatable stories of individual people, it can help introduce these ideas and experiences, and also, once people connect to these individual stories, then help us start conversations about how do we collectively process and think about and take action on health issues at a larger level. I'm sorry that I couldn't be with you live for this virtual roundtable, but please feel free to contact me. Here's my contact information. If you have any follow-up feedback or thoughts, questions, or comments. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Li-Vollmer. The recording will be up, so everyone's encouraged to send in your questions to Dr. Li-Vollmer. You saw her email up there. I could also share it with those of you who are interested later on. But let's open up the floor to questions for Briony first.
Meenakshi, may I?
Yes, Roy, please go ahead.
I was trying to make a combined response to both the talks. Briony Barr's talk showed us that not all microorganisms deal with humans. As in, she showed us several species that form symbiosis with other organisms, which is interesting. And then Dr. Li-Vollmer points out that comics have a very human perspective of putting things across, which makes them easier to understand. And she showed us the metrics, how people's interest increase when you show things in a comic way rather than a prosaic way. So I was thinking, we generally have this analogy for non-microscopic animals. We classify them as domestic and wild animals that are interested to be around us and animals that are not. So we could maybe think of similar analogies when it comes to microscopic organisms as well. As a large, as Briony Barr points out, a large amount of microscopic organisms aren't harmful to us, and many of them aren't interested in us. There are, there are cryophiles, and there are organisms that can live in extreme conditions that don't want to be around humans. So I was thinking, particularly in the context of drawing, we could maybe include creatures like tardigrades, which I don't know if they are proper microbes, but they have a aesthetic appeal that maybe something like a plasmodium does not. They look like tiny bears, So that was my observation. That's
Briony, do you want to respond to that?
I'll just say there's a tardigrade, or also known as a water bear, in one of the Small Friends book stories, I think in the nematode story. And yeah, there's a lot of very interesting looking microbes there. There's a lot of rods and blobs and things, but tardigrades are great. I don't know if they're actually a microbe, but they're certainly very, because you can just see them, I think, with your eyes. But yeah.
Yeah, I think the visual appeal, how you make sort of small things visually appealing. I think, Briony, your work was a really testament to that. Really, really beautiful and really, stunning way of showing it. And I think when we look at that microscopic level, thinking about how we, it's not about anthropomorphizing these things necessarily, but about thinking about how we make them appealing. I think there's so many stories around that help us sort of as ecologists sort of connect to that. I've got ecology background and I studied water beetles. And I'm a massive fan of beetles. And I remember reading an article about why is it that insects, why do we not connect with them as much as the big cuddly polar bear? And it was linked to the number of legs, right? We've got 4 limbs, polar bears have got 4 limbs, and insects have 6, and that sort of difference is somehow distancing. But also there must be ways in which we can sort of reduce that distance. I know at Wellcome Collection they've got these cuddly toy versions of microbes. They're brilliant. I can't get enough of them. They've got all different types of diseases and different types of microbes, and they are really, really cool. So I think artists, we need our artists basically to sort of help us with creating those connections between different parts of nature as well, and that can be really sort of fun and enjoyable and very beautiful as well, I think.
Yeah, there's I thinking in particular of bacteriophage. They're the main viral characters in the Invisible War, and I think the shape of the main bacteriophage in the book is called a myophage, but like bacterial viruses are like incredible looking, and it's just beyond alien. I mean, yeah, so there are, there's the sort of hard ones to work with, but then there are ones that are just so unbelievable. But yeah, I encourage anyone to look up bacteriophages, and particularly the myophage. But yeah, I think in our stories, there is some anthropomorphization going on just to sort of help tell the story. But I think a lot of people whack eyes on creatures, if they want to bring them to life. It could be a pencil, or it could be a book, or whatever, or it could be a microbe, put some eyes on it. And we really were very resistant to that idea. I think especially Ben, who did the drawings for Follow Your Gut, which was the very colorful graphic novel that I showed. He did a lot with the body positions and the sort of gestures of the microbes to try to tell the story. And if they had hairs, flagella or little hairs or things like that, he did a great job of sort of, giving them life and character and stuff. So, yeah.
Brilliant. So this brings me to my question, which is very connected, of course, narratologically or narratively speaking. when you say you're trying to work on a microscopic scale while characterizing these microbes or while depicting them, what does that actually mean? Because aren't we, even when you are centering the microbe, as the protagonist of the story, aren't we really still working with human scales? I mean, what does it actually mean to be working on microbial scales? What you're doing there, if it is a story, there's got to be some sort of an affective thrust to the story. And if you're going to put that in, aren't we again resorting to human emotion? So at the center of it all, do you not think that it's still relative to how we conceive of the world?
Yeah, I mean, we're humans, you know, trying to get inside the minds, of these, single-celled creatures, or, and so ultimately, yeah, we are humans telling the story. But I think, it's about imagining, what they might be experiencing. So, for example, and the way, particularly in the words as well, how you tell the story, how you represent the experience. So, for example, in The Forest and the Tree, which is about the fungal spore, at the start of the story, the fungal spore is a singular entity. And so, they speak of themselves as I. And then once it connects with the bigger network in the forest of mycorrhizal fungi, it's the protagonist speaks of itself as we. So I think it's in partly it's in the words, I mean, yes, we're anthropomorphizing, and we're sort of putting our minds, we're representing microbes in a way that, we'll never know if it's true, and they don't have emotions and all this kind of stuff. But that's just a tool for communication. But I think, yeah, the words in particular are a way that you can help humans, to imagine the world from a more than human perspective.
Thank you. Are there any more questions for Briony, or any more observations about Meredith's talk? All right. I think we've come to the end of the roundtable, and we will wrap this up right now. Thank you so much to all of these speakers for bringing together so many diverse perspectives on representing microbes. To formally thank everybody present here, may I now invite Professor Anna Kurian, who is Faculty Fellow, the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies at the University of Hyderabad.
Thank you, Meenakshi. And thank you to all of you who turned up this night in Australia, mid-morning in England, and Somdatta, who's right here in Hyderabad with us. Thank you especially to the speakers. And as always, I am totally non-science person, as in I am frightened of science. I don't like it. But I enjoyed listening to this roundtable. So I think I should also thank Meenakshi for having organized it, because it helped me to think about things as well. It was particularly interesting to see that we went from antimicrobial resistance to a more post-human perspective, where we were integrating the microbes with humans and looking at a world where we all coexist, evolve together, without necessarily declaring all-out war immediately. I'm very grateful indeed also to Briony and Sara for putting up those links when the video glitched, because we were all like focusing on Meenakshi, and Meenakshi was getting more and more flaked out. So just having those links there made a big difference. Thank you very much for thinking of that and for doing it as well. As always, thank you to Pramod, who is the UNESCO chair, under whose aegis all of this becomes possible, and Roy and all the others who come for all our events. It's been a great beginning to 2025, and let's hope it just gets better from here. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kurian. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you, Professor Nair. Thank you to a couple of colleagues who joined in from Sara University, these members of the Vulnerability Studies Network, and everybody else who's stayed with us through the 2.5 hours of this roundtable. Thank you, and here's looking forward to several more events such as this. Bye.